Good morning to you all. Good to see you. Beautiful morning. It's just wonderful to be here. Some of you may be wondering why I'm taking this off. It's because I can't talk and breathe at the same time when I'm trying to concentrate. It just gets in my way. So if you'll excuse me, I'll just remove that for the time that I'm preaching. One of the most important things for a democracy to remain free is someone say, well, why is he talking about democracies and freedom? Because without freedom, we can't preach the gospel. If they tell us we can't preach the gospel, we got big problems. And one of the great things that we have enjoyed through the beginning of this country to this very present time is the freedom of speech. And it's somewhat political today, I understand that, because there are many people in our country who want to control what everybody says. If you go to one of the high-paid schools, you'll find that they have commissions which review every speaker that comes in to give a speech. And if they don't like what this person is, they tell them they can't talk. We don't want to hear what you have to say. So their free speech is not as free. It's only free for some that they like. It's not free for everybody. And yet in our Constitution, it clearly says that we all have the right of free speech. I get a newspaper called the Epoch Times, and there was an interesting article in April. It was written by a man named Lawrence W. Reed, and he was talking about free speech. And one of the things, so much of the quotes that I have in here come from that article, and I want to give credit to him and you'll see who he quotes and everything. So you can go and look these up and see that these quotes are accurate. These are not paraphrased, they're the actual words of these individuals to the best of our knowledge. I don't know what the religious preference was for the people that I quote here, but they seem to lean towards what is right and correct in God's eyes, let me say that. The other thing I'd like to say is that most people in the United States underestimate the importance of free speech. That is, we took high school classes, all of us, we had civics, they talked about the amendments and everything, and we kind of say, yeah, okay, we get it. It's until you get into later life and you realize how important free speech is. They go, oh yeah, I remember Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and talking about that in class. And when we're too young, we don't appreciate it. But as we get older, we realize that these people knew what they were talking about. Let me tell you something about some of the things that people have said about free speech. Some of you will recognize the name of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass lived in the 1800s. He died in 1896, I believe, and he was a champion abolitionist. He was a black man, but he was a free black man. And his whole life was spent fighting against the idea of slavery. And this is what Frederick Douglass says. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. We always think of free speech as just about me, but here's what he says. It's a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as those of the speaker. It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak and hear it as it would be to rob him of his money. And of course, his main theme was always dealing with free the people. But if you ever get a chance to read any one thing, you find out that he wasn't just simply talking about black people. He was talking about this is a human concept, and what is right and what is wrong is wrong. He understood that without the truth being spoken about slavery, it would never stop. The truth has to be put out there, and the only way that can happen is when the speech is free. You can say it. And that means that those who wanted to maintain slavery, they had the right to speak for it, but then the others, the abolitionists, had the right to speak against it. And he spent his life doing that. Recent polls revealed that approximately 50% of the respondents indicated that the First Amendment, which is free speech is based on, the First Amendment is outdated and ought to be rewritten. And then when you look further in these polls, you find out that it was particularly evident among millennials. So let me define what a millennial is. A millennial is anyone who was born between 1981 and 1996, because they came into their maturity as the millennial changed. And they don't think the First Amendment is as important. Matter of fact, there's a great majority of them. It said over 50% don't think that the First Amendment should stand as it is. It needs to be changed. And they tend to place political correctness and cancel culture above free speech. Very interesting. Now, Douglas expanded on what he had said about free speech. He gave another speech in the city of Boston. It's called The Plea for Free Speech in Boston. And this is what he said, continuing with this idea. And I want you to listen carefully to this. He said, thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers founded in injustice and wrong are sure to tremble if men are allowed to reason of righteousness, temperance, and of judgment to come in their presence. Slavery cannot tolerate free speech. Go back to the first sentence. Thrones, dominions, principalities, and powers. Did that ring a bell with you? Did you hear that someplace else before? Sure you did. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, this is what Paul says. For by him, that is Jesus Christ, all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have were created through him and by him. Through him and for him. I think Frederick Douglass knew his Bible because he took that concept and he applied it directly. He applied it directly to a problem here. Thrones, dominions, principles, and powers. I found that when I read that, the bell ran off right. This man knew his Bible. Going on, the great writer and philosopher, some of you may recognize the name John Milton. Well, he wrote Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost was talking about the condition of mankind from when he was created, paradise gained, to paradise lost through sin and all the other problems. And I'll tell you the truth, I haven't read the whole thing. I've only read excerpts of it because it's a pretty big, thick book. But he lived in England in the 1600s. And he gave a speech in Parliament, and I'm going to try and pronounce the name of his speech. I have practiced it, and my tongue gets in the way of my teeth, and I can't see what I'm saying. So anyway, it's the Areopagita. If you want it, I got it written here, okay? But this is what he called it. It's a Latin name. And this is what he says. He said this to Parliament. Give me liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties. I think what he's saying here, free speech comes first and all the other liberties come after that. Because without the ability to discuss, and that when he says argue here, he doesn't mean a negative argument, people yelling. He says it's a debate. An argument there is, I place this argument before you that this is true. You say it's not. Let's talk about it and let's work on it. That's the true. When we hear argument, we hear negative and loud voices. When these guys are talking about argument, it's more like a legal debate. And he's saying without free speech, you can't have anything else because you've got to be able to talk about it. You've got to be able to discuss these things, the good, the bad, and the ugly all together. You've got to be able to reason these things. And what does Isaiah say? Come, he's quoting, God has told him to say, is come, let us reason together. And if you don't have free speech, how are you going to reason together? So you can see where this concept of free speech and the Bible go directly together. How many people do you know who do not want to hear the great Bible story? I know each of us know people like it. I don't want to talk about the Bible. It's the greatest story ever told. And yet if you mention it, no, I don't want to talk about any of that stuff. Don't want to talk about it. That's free speech. And what they're saying is you don't have the right to talk to me. It's their loss. This is the thing. And that's what you have to tell them. If you don't hear this story, there's a great portion of your life that's going to be missing. That's free speech. Albert Einstein. You all know that name. Albert Einstein was a German. He was a Jew. He was not a Christian, but he was a thinker. And he wrote an essay called Ideas and Opinions. And most people never read this because they're always worried about it. E equals mc squared and all his theories and all this other stuff. They don't get to some of this stuff, but he was a real philosopher. And this is what he said. Laws alone cannot secure freedom of expression. In order that every man may present his views without penalty, there must be a spirit of tolerance in the entire population. In other words, I will tolerate what you have to say, but also then you must tolerate what I have to say. And through that dialogue, we can come to an understanding. I think he was correct. If you look at our culture today, the spirit of tolerance is being lost. And they call conservatives intolerant. But by saying that, they are intolerant themselves. Conservatives are not intolerant. Conservatives will sit and listen and everything, but as soon as you start to give it up, no, you're wrong, can't listen to that. Don't want to do that. As I was mentioning earlier about the schools of higher education, just try to get a venue of talking about creationism. Can you imagine Brother David, who's very good at talking about the argument for creationism, going to a local community college and having a debate? They won't even discuss it. No, that's religion. And yet, the best evidence that we have for creation is pure science. It's not theory, it's pure science, because you have the facts right in front of you. They won't talk about it. That's suppression of speech. John Stuart Mill, in 1859, he was a British member of the British Parliament. He's written a whole bunch of stuff, but this one is called On Liberty. And he says, strange it is, and this is the English, the British language is a little convoluted here, but I'll go through it. Strange it is that men should admit the validity of the argument for free speech, but object to their being pushed to the extreme, and that's in quotes, and originally he said it's in quotes, pushed to the extreme, not seeing that unless reasons are good for the extreme case, they are not good in any case. Now what he's saying is this. He said that some would give the right of free speech, and only in special circumstances, but in general, free speech must be limited. That's what he's saying here. And he points out that if it's okay for free speech in extreme circumstances, then it's okay for everybody in every circumstance. And now, you have to remember, in Parliament, they had a king. So his reference here is that, the king can say anything he wants without anybody saying anything. But the average worker on the street can't say anything. He's told to be quiet. And what he's saying is what's good for the king is good for everybody. If the king can speak out and have free speech, then we ought to, as citizens of Britain, have free speech. The extension of this thinking leads to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The 5th and the 14th Amendments. And you said, you have the right to life, you have the right to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Doesn't guarantee those things, but you have the right to pursue them, to go for them. Nobody can tell you can't be happy. There's another, these guys are called Trenchard and Gordon. This was in the early 1700s. They wrote a series of 144 essays addressing these many issues in the British society. And they're called Cato's Letters. Now, Cato was an orator, and he was the foe of Julius Caesar. So it goes all the way back 2,000 years. And when Julius Caesar said, hey, I know we should go do this, and Cato would stand up, well, if you do that, there's going to be ramifications and all these problems. And Julius said, let's just sit down for a while. But he was one of the Roman senators. So he was a thorn in Julius Caesar's side, but he was well respected. So they call these 144 essays Cato's Letters. And here's what one of these letters said. Without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom. Now, how do we get wisdom? We exchange ideas. We learn, right? And how do you learn? Well, you have to listen, you have to read, you have to participate in it. He said, without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom and no such thing as public liberty. Now, the reason they mentioned public liberty, because at that time there was in your household you can do whatever you want, but out on the street you can't. Well, we'll get into some of the limitations in a few minutes. And he says, without freedom of speech, which is the right of every man, as far be it his, he does not hurt or control the right of another. And this is the only check it ought to suffer. In other words, we have the right to free speech unless we hurt somebody else with it, or we try to control them. So really what we're talking about there's limits to free speech, and they're based on whether this speech does harm or seeks to control another. So we have laws with this, laws against slander and libel. You can't go into a crowded theater and yell fire. That's my right. I can do whatever. No, you can't. Why? Because it causes harm to other people. Somebody's going to get hurt in that. You can't do that. Now, if it's a real fire, yeah, you got to do it. But if there's no fire, you can't go in there and do that. So there are limits to free speech. So, and this is where the whole liberal side of our politics. Oh, well, I don't like what you say. Well, is it causing you harm? Well, I just don't like it. Not liking it is a great difference between causing harm. Am I saying that, for instance, am I casting dispersions on your parentage? No, then I'm not causing you harm. So free speech has always been an issue in our country about how it's used. As with any right or privilege, we must apply and use free speech carefully. Look at what Paul did when he was visiting Athens. Here's an excellent Bible example. So Paul goes to Athens, and he's wandering around, and he's looking, and he comes to this place where there are all these statues to these false gods. And he's getting a little steamed about it. He says, what's the matter with these people? I thought the Greeks were pretty smart. And this is what it says in Acts 17:16. His spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. Now, when it says Paul's spirit being provoked, you know he was getting steamed. Yeah, he said, this is not right. And you can just imagine, but now Paul's seasoned now. He's a little bit more seasoned than he was when he started. And he's certainly not as impetuous as Peter ever was. So he could have stood there and denounced all of Athens for being steeped in idolatry. But how does he address the Athenians who had gathered on Mars Hill in the Areopagus to listen to him? He says this, he says, men of Athens. And he could have said, you're a rotten bunch of guys. You don't know what he says. I observe that you are very religious in all respects, based on what he had seen, because they didn't want to miss any gods. And he says this, for while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, that which you worship in ignorance, I now proclaim to you. Free speech. If he had alienated them by telling them they were bums and didn't know what they were doing, do you think they're going to listen to him? Of course not. This is what free speech is about. Find a way to say the difficult things that the other person continues to listen. Because once they shut down, you've lost them. You all know you watch a TV, you watch the first couple of minutes, I'm out of here. I can't watch it anymore, right? But you see the other TV, it gives you the hook. And even though it's not the greatest show in the world, because it's got that hook and you're interested, you'll watch it. It's the same with our free speech. Not that we're deceiving anybody, but you find a way to say the difficult things in a manner that they keep their ears open. Once they close the ears, it doesn't matter. You can be the greatest orator in the world, they're not going to listen to you. So you got to get them to keep the ears open. Paul says this about his freedom in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And again, limits on freedom. If food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again so that I will not cause my brother to stumble. This is the cautious use of freedom, including speech. We don't want to cause our brothers or sisters or anyone else to stumble. Now, the idea is to stumble is to get away from the truth. You fall down, you don't get up. And Paul says, I won't do that. But you notice it says, if. He doesn't say, I'm never going to eat meat again. He said, if. So when Paul was in that situation, when there was a weaker member there who saw him eating meat and it may have been sacrificed to idols, the weaker member would say, oh, Paul's doing it, I can do it. And Paul goes on and explains this is a matter of conscience. He said, because idols are nothing, meat sacrificed to them doesn't mean anything. And as you're a mature Christian, you understand it doesn't mean anything. But for the weaker Christian or the newer Christian who doesn't understand it, I'm not going to eat meat in front of him. So Paul is telling us to be very careful with the liberties and the freedoms that we have. So for those who understand the truth, they are not bound by the fear associated with these things like eating meat sacrificed to idols. In verse 8, he says that food does not commend us to God. Now remember, Peter and the vision of the blanket and all the animals on it, and he says, "Rise, Peter, and eat." And he says, "No, Lord, nothing unclean has ever entered my mouth." And he says, "Yes, but God says, hey, I made it clean, it's good." And then Peter realizes that the real message here is not about food, it's about the Gentiles. They were unclean, and God says, no, you go to them and preach to them. So Peter had to learn that lesson. It makes no difference to God what we eat, because food doesn't make us holy or unholy, except if we hurt the temple. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, it says our body is a temple. We should not do anything to damage the temple. So if we're doing something which is damaging the temple, that's not right. So we should change that. And that includes what we eat. So we have to be careful with the liberties we have. We must try to use freedom of speech wisely. Jesus told the apostles not to throw pearls after swine. You know that. What was he saying? He says, you preach the truth, but after a while, if they're going to trample on your words and your ears are closed, move along. Don't give it to them anymore. So that's using the wise use of freedom of speech. When we find someone who will continually treat the word of God with contempt, it's fruitless to continue. And that's a hard thing to do, because particularly if it's a family member and we love them, it's hard not to talk about the gospel message. We want them to come to salvation. But there's a time when you have to back off. And as Paul said, I've turned them over to Satan. In other words, you want to do that? Let me know how that works out for you. That's what Paul was saying, because it's not going to be good. Some people learn that way. Some people never learn. It is a great sin that people are demanding that everyone be politically correct in speech. I think that's a sin, because the truth gets trampled when we have to be politically correct, just so we're afraid it's going to offend someone. Maybe that offense is pushing that right button that'll cause that person to say, hey, wait a minute, God is not in my life. Maybe I should look into this. And if we offend people preaching the word of God, so be it. So be it. We don't have to be politically correct there. So this idea that we can't say anything because it may offend someone, Jesus doesn't agree with that at all. He says this in John 8:32, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. How do you know the truth? Probably because someone talked to you about it. And if freedom of speech was not available, you wouldn't have heard it. You would still be in slavery to sin. So Jesus is saying the truth has to be spoken. And some people don't want to hear it. And sometimes it's hard to speak the truth. But like Paul, you have to find a way to say it so that your ears are still open. Sometimes, look, this is a very difficult subject for you and for me. But I have to tell you this, and I want you to try to listen to me because I love you. And a lot of times that'll break that argument of, I don't want to listen to this. And they'll patiently listen. And maybe something in what you have to say is going to just be the right thing to say. How can one know the truth unless one explains it to them? And without freedom to speak, the word will suffer, and those who do not exercise truth when they are able will have to answer to the judge. The one who won't hear it is going to have to answer to the judge. The ones who won't speak it and know the truth and let them stumble and go into sin, we're going to have to answer. We're going to be responsible for what we say, and that is the truth of everything in the Bible, is that we are responsible for what we do and say, not somebody else. Who did this? You got a couple kids and then the lamp gets knocked over. Okay, what happened? My brother did it, or the dog did it. You know, that our society trains people to do that, to give excuses instead of, yeah, it was me. You know, one of my children, well, I should say all my children, but one in particular has this great sense of fairness. And when he gets caught, yeah, it was me. So one day in school, he and his buddies decide to take a chocolate chip cookie and make a picture of it in the copy machine, which was in the hallway. And there's 4 of them there. So they sneak the cookie out of the cafeteria, and then, of course, they're giggling and having a great time. They put it on there, hit the button, because somebody had left the key in there, one of the teachers. They hit the button, and it makes a picture. So he starts making a couple more pictures, and who walks up? One of the faculty members. Okay, guys, who did this? And they're all quiet. And my kid says, yeah, it was me. So he was responsible, because in our household, you're responsible for what you do. So they let the other 3 go. He wasn't worried about getting punished for making a picture. He was mad at those 3 guys. And he told them that afterward. He said, you guys let me stand in there. That was not right. You did that too. You should have opened your mouth. And they said, no, we would have got punished. He said, that's not the idea. He said, I thought we were friends. Friends don't do that. And he's right. Friends don't let the other one take the blame for something that you participated in. You stand up and say, no, I was part of that too. That was a great lesson for him to learn. You know, people are going to cop out. They're not going to take responsibility. Look at the percentage there. One did the right thing. Not the cookie thing, but maybe the cookie. One did the right thing. Three were cowards. 3 were cowards. It's always the minority that will do the right thing. Remember Elijah. Lord, take me now. I'm done. God says, no, there's still 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You've got work to do. Get on with it. Okay. And he goes on and does his work. His reward, he was taken up to heaven. He didn't die on this earth. He was alive. Didn't have to face death. So there's great things in the Bible, great incidents, but free speech, that's what this is about. I think the founders of our nation understood that. Now, there were a lot of different religions but most of them were what we call Judeo-Christian-based ethics, which means that the ethical force behind living, morality, what is right, ethics, doing things the right way, they knew it came from the Bible. Do you know in the beginning of our country that in the national papers it would say, your leaders have declared that Friday will be a national day of fasting. Pray for the country and for the good things that can happen. And the whole country would fast. Can you imagine that happening today? We have separation of, the amendment, the way it's written, it says that the government will make no law for or against religion, which means it's not going to have a national religion. That's what that amendment is about. And it gives us free speech also, but it means that, for instance, you have the Church of England. The church has, and in other countries, they're nationalized. So if you're not a member of that church, you don't get good things. Things don't happen your way. And the founders of our country said, we're not doing that. There's going to be freedom. You worship how you want to worship. You have the freedom to do that. You have the liberty to do that. And yet today, they have twisted that and said, well, there shouldn't be any religion in schools. There shouldn't be that. That's not what that was intended. It was meant that the nation would not have official national religion, that all men were free to worship their God as they saw fit. And that was good. And to some degree, it's still good to this day, but it's being pounded. It's being pounded on by those who do not want any God in their lives at all. And they push that onto, they're free to have that. If they don't want God in their life, they can do what they want. But now they've pushed that on other people. And having no God, and this is what the government is. The government is godless. And you're constantly getting pushed. And we're constantly getting squashed. And that is not right, because having no God is the God of the government then. It's the religion of the government. It's the religion of that end of the spectrum of all the political things going on. So as a result, in saying they have no God, they do have a God. And that God is no God. And they will put everything into it trying to do that. David has talked about some of these things. Is how the country seems to have swung from the Judeo-Christian ethic and is beginning to swing over here to socialism, communism, and all these other things which are godless. And I keep saying, how do those things work out? Communism, not so good. Socialism, in I think it was Norway, which is a socialistic nation, they had a hard time getting vaccines. Well, they have a great medical system. It doesn't cost you anything. You can go to any hospital, walk in, they take care of you. You can't get vaccines. So anyhow, let us be careful with what we say, but let us speak the truth. Let us exercise our right. It's not a privilege, it's a right. We have the right to free speech. And let us not be so concerned about somebody else. Let us be concerned about the truth that is in the Bible. Let us go and speak those things and speak them truthfully and accurately. And let us ask them in love. I want to talk to you because I love you, not because I want to beat you over the head with this. If I beat you over the head with this, it's going to ruin my book and hurt your head. That's all it's going to do. You know, and yes, people say, well, the Bible's a shield, but you can't go around like this. You can't do that. You've got to gain their confidence and their credit and have some credibility. Tell them you love them and you care for them, and that's why you want to talk to them about this. And think about Paul, how carefully he chose his words. But he let them know they have a problem, but I have the solution. And he did that, and he did it very well. So we have examples in the Bible. Think about Jesus facing the Sanhedrin. They didn't want to hear anything he had to say. And at times he had to get pretty tough. But he spoke the truth, always speaking the truth. So let us try to do that also. Brothers and sisters, I'm so glad that you had the patience to listen to me and give me this liberty to speak to you. Thank you so much for that. Those of you watching at home, I appreciate your time also. And I hope this has done some good for all of us. Brothers and sisters, I offer you the opportunity. If you have problems in your lives, you're in need of prayers in the congregation, please. As we close here, you can come forward and tell me what that is. If you're subject to the gospel call and you have not been immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins, now is an excellent time to do that. Come forward, sit with me at the front, and we'll make those arrangements, and we'll take care of that. We'll immerse you for your forgiveness of your sins in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. When you come up out of the water, you are a new person. Your soul is spotless. All those things that have happened to you throughout your life that you are constantly hanging on there, all that baggage that you're carrying, gone. God remembers that no more. You'll remember it, but that's to teach you not to do those things. But God remembers that no more. You are now one of his children. If you're subject to any of those calls, please come forward as we join you as David leads us in the next song.